The wind had a name in this part of the territory, and it was a mean one. It came off the high plateau with nothing to slow it, a relentless current of air that scoured the land and carried the grit of red canyons into every corner of Mesquite Crossing. It was a wind that chapped lips, stole moisture from the soil, and whispered of thirst. It blew through the autumn of 1880, a year when the rains had forgotten to come. In the small adobe building that served as both post office and schoolhouse, Eleanor Hart felt the dust more than she saw it. It was a fine red powder that settled on the mail slots, coated the inkwells, and left a faint, earthy taste in the back of her throat. She ran a cloth over the rough-hewn plank that was her counter, a futile gesture that only stirred the dust into a brief, dancing cloud before it settled again. The air smelled of dry paper, aging leather from the mailbags, and the faint, sweet scent of the salt cedar that grew along the nearly empty creek bed. Through the single wavy glass window, she could see the entire town. It was not much to see. There was the saloon, a raw timber structure that seemed to soak up the day's heat and bleed it back out at night with the sounds of rough laughter and a perpetually out-of-tune piano. Across the wide, dusty street was the fort, its flagpole a lonely finger pointing at a vast, indifferent sky. And beyond that, stretching east until it vanished into the shimmering heat, was the reason for the town's recent surge in population and anxiety the surveyed path of the incoming railroad. Wooden stakes marked its relentless march across the landscape, a promise of progress that felt more like an invasion. Eleanor had come to believe in the law because it was all she had left. Her husband, Samuel, had believed in the earth, in the promise of silver hidden in the jagged hills. The earth had taken him, a collapse of rock and timber in a mine that gave up nothing but widows. The law, she hoped, was more reliable. It was on paper, in documents and deeds, a structure meant to be stronger than rock. But she had lived in the territory long enough to know that paper burned, and the law could be as fragile as a dry leaf in that mean wind. Her small claim, the post office, the life she had scraped together from Samuel's absence, was all recorded on a piece of paper currently in a safe, on a train, making its way from the territorial capital. That piece of paper was her anchor in a world that felt determined to blow away. A man moved at the edge of town, a silhouette against the blazing red rock of the distant mesas. He did not move like the soldiers from the fort, all stiff angles and impatience. He did not move like the railroad surveyors, with their hurried, proprietary strides. He moved like he was part of the landscape, a seamless extension of the heat and the dust. Taza. He led a string of 4 horses, their coats shimmering like polished stone. He was a Chiricahua, a name that was a curse in the mouths of some and a whisper of fear in others. To Eleanor, he was simply the man who brought the mail pouches from the outlying ranches when the regular rider was too drunk or too scared. He did his business with few words, his eyes taking in everything, his stillness a force in itself. She knew the stories. She had heard the soldiers in the saloon speak of the wars, of the reservations that were little more than prisons, of the families scattered like quail. Taza wore the past not as a scar, but as a cloak. It was in the way he watched the horizon, the way he listened more than he spoke, the way his hands, gentle and certain on the reins of a half-wild Mustang, could calm a beast with a touch. He lived in a small jacal by the creek, training horses for the traders, a man caught between the world that had been stolen from him and the world that did not want him. He wanted only what the wind and the land already knew a place to be, without fear. The dust swirled as a carriage pulled up before the saloon, a fine, polished thing utterly out of place in Mesquite Crossing. The door opened and out stepped Silas Vane. He was a man made of smooth surfaces. His suit was dark and immaculate. His boots shone with a black polish that seemed to repel the red dust by sheer force of will. He smiled, a flash of white teeth in a well-groomed beard, but the smile never reached his eyes. His eyes were the color of a winter sky, and they missed nothing. He was the railroad, given flesh. He spoke of prosperity, of connecting their small town to the great cities of the East, of a future bright with commerce. But when he looked at the land, he did not see the grama grass or the sacred mesas or the homes people had built with their own hands. He saw tracts, parcels, and profits. Following him out of the saloon was a younger man, his blue uniform a stark, clean contrast to the dusty environment. Lieutenant Abel Crow was new to the post, and his ambition was as sharp and obvious as the crease in his trousers. He looked at Taza, who was now tying his horses to the hitching rail, and his expression hardened. To Lieutenant Crow, an Apache was an Apache, a problem to be solved, a savage to be tamed, a name to be made for himself by demonstrating his command. He saw a threat, a relic of a wildness he was here to extinguish. He said something to Silas Vane, his voice too low to carry, but his contempt was a palpable thing, an ugly ripple in the afternoon heat. Vane just smiled his smooth smile and placed a calming hand on the lieutenant's arm, a gesture of control, not comfort. They were two sides of the same coin, one promising a future built with money and steel, the other promising peace through the barrel of a gun. Eleanor watched them, a cold knot tightening in her stomach. They were the men who were changing the world, and she was not sure she would have a place in the one they were building. Life in Mesquite Crossing was measured in small, essential things. The arrival of a freight wagon was a major event. The price of salt was a constant topic of conversation. The depth of the water in a neighbor's well was a matter of public concern. It was a life of details, of noticing the way a horse favored a leg, of recognizing the particular shade of a cloud that might, just might, hold rain. Eleanor was teaching the handful of children in her care how to read from an old primer when the telegraph key in the corner of the room began its frantic chattering. The operator, a young man named Billy, burst through her door a minute later, his face pale beneath a sheen of sweat. He did not even bother with a greeting. The 9 o'clock train, he gasped. The one from the capital. It was stopped a dozen miles out. Robbed. A stillness fell over the small room. The children looked up from their books, their eyes wide. Eleanor felt the air leave her lungs. The 9 o'clock train. The first reports were chaos, a jumble of panic and speculation. A gang of men, masked. They had known exactly what they were after. Not the passengers' valuables, not the mailbags. They went straight for the baggage car and the heavy iron safe bolted to the floor. They had used dynamite, blew the whole car open. The safe was gone. By late afternoon, the first of the passengers began to straggle into town, their faces streaked with soot and disbelief. The story solidified, taking on the hard edges of fact. A gang, yes, a dozen of them at least. They rode like demons, their horses bearing a strange brand on the flank, a black spur. They had vanished into the canyons as if the earth had swallowed them. But it was the rumor that arrived with the last of the passengers that spread through Mesquite Crossing like a brush fire. It started in the saloon, a low murmur that quickly grew into a confident assertion. One of the passengers, a man who had gotten a look at one of the robbers as his mask slipped, swore he saw the dark hair, the high cheekbones, an Apache. He said they all were. The word was passed from man to man, each telling adding a new, imagined detail. It was a raid, a return to the old ways. Lieutenant Crow stood on the saloon porch, his face grim and set. He did not question the rumor. He embraced it. This was his chance. The moment he had been waiting for. An outrage, a clear act of aggression. It was all the justification he needed to act, to prove his worth. Silas Vane stood beside him, a concerned look carefully arranged on his features. He spoke to the small crowd that had gathered, his voice a balm of reason over their rising anger. A terrible business, he said. A tragedy. This is precisely why the railroad is so vital. It will bring order. It will bring security. It will protect your property. His eyes swept over the anxious faces, and he knew he had them. Eleanor stood in the doorway of the post office. The children sent home long ago. She felt a profound and terrifying hollowness. The safe, the land deeds, Her deed. The legal proof of her existence here, of her right to this small piece of dusty ground, was gone. Vanished into the same wilderness that had swallowed the robbers. The paper was gone, and all that was left was the rumor. She looked across the street and saw Taza standing by his horses, preparing to leave. He had heard the news. She could see it in his posture, in the coiled stillness that had replaced his usual calm. He knew what the word Apache meant when it was spoken in a tone of accusation. It meant roundups. It meant soldiers riding into camps. It meant a presumption of guilt that no amount of evidence could erase. Their individual fears, hers of losing her home and his of losing his freedom, were now linked by the same crime. A crime she was beginning to suspect was not as simple as it seemed. The wind picked up, blowing a fresh wave of red dust through the twilight. It felt like a warning. The ground beneath her feet had never felt so unsteady. The day after the robbery dawned with the same brassy, unforgiving sun. A false hope arrived with the morning stagecoach, its wheels churning up clouds of the ever-present red dust. Eleanor stood at the door of the post office, her heart a tight, anxious knot in her chest. The driver, a man named Henderson, whose face was a roadmap of sun and worry, handed her the usual canvas sacks of letters and parcels. He avoided her eyes. "There is no special pouch from the capital," he said, his voice low. "The officials on the train said it was in the safe. All of it. Gone." The knot in Eleanor's chest dissolved into a cold, spreading dread. It was true. The paper that said she owned this building, this small patch of ground where she taught children their letters and sorted the mail that connected this lonely place to the wider world, was nothing more than ash and memory. She retreated into the suffocating heat of the adobe building, the smell of paper and ink now seeming like a mockery. Her world had been reduced to a rumor and the echo of a dynamite blast. She was wiping down the counter for the 10th time that morning when a shadow fell across the doorway. Silas Vane entered, bringing with him the scent of expensive cologne and oiled leather. He removed his hat, his movements smooth and practiced, revealing hair the color of dark honey, perfectly combed. He gave her the smile that did not touch his cold eyes. "Mrs. Hart," he began, his voice a low, confidential purr. "A terrible business yesterday. Truly terrible. It shows just how precarious life can be out here. Does it not? How quickly things can be lost." Eleanor said nothing, her hands stilling on the dusty counter. "I have come to you as a friend," he continued, stepping further into the room. "I have some familiarity with territorial law. A formality. You understand. But with the official deeds destroyed, the court will have no choice but to declare all those land claims null and void in due course. The land will revert to the territory, at which point the railroad syndicate, as the primary agent of development, will have the first option to purchase." He let the words hang in the air, each one a carefully placed stone in the wall he was building around her. He took a step closer. "However, I have a great deal of sympathy for the settlers, for widows like yourself, so my company has authorized me to make a private offer to purchase your interest in this claim as it stands. It will not be what you might have hoped for. Of course, a gesture of goodwill. You might call it $100, in cash, today. It is, I am afraid, a far better outcome than the nothing you will have in a month's time." $100. It was an insult. It was less than the cost of the lumber for the roof. He was a vulture, circling, smelling the death of her future. The offer was not a kindness. It was a threat wrapped in the language of commerce. "No," she said. The word was quiet, but it was as solid and unmovable as the bedrock beneath the town. Vane's smile tightened at the edges. "A foolish decision. Mrs. Hart, sentiment is an expensive luxury. The law, you will find, is not sentimental at all." He placed his hat back on his head, gave a slight, mocking bow, and was gone, leaving the scent of his cologne to curdle in the dry air. Eleanor felt a desperate need for open space. for a sky that was not framed by a window. She walked out into the oppressive glare of the main street. The air was thick with tension. Men stood in small, tight groups, their voices low and angry. The word Apache was a constant, ugly refrain. A freight wagon, overloaded with supplies for the railroad surveyors, rumbled down the street. One of its heavy wheels hit a rock and the axle gave a loud crack, like a rifle shot. The sound spooked a rangy sorrel tied to the hitching post outside the saloon. The horse screamed, its eyes rolling white with panic. It reared, snapping the leather reins with a sound like a whip. It plunged into the street, a panicked mass of muscle and fear. Directly in its path, a small boy, no older than 5, stood frozen, his face a mask of terror. Time seemed to slow. Shouts erupted. Men scrambled back. But from the edge of the street, a figure moved with a fluid grace that was the opposite of the horse's chaotic terror. Taza did not run. He flowed. He moved into the horse's path, not to confront it, but to intercept it. His body angled, his hands low and open. He made a low, guttural sound, a sound that was not a word but a feeling, a sound that spoke of earth and calm. The horse, expecting a blow, expecting a fight, found instead a quiet, unthreatening presence. It shied, turning its panicked momentum, and Taza moved with it, his hand reaching out, not for the bridle, but for the side of its neck. A firm, steady pressure. He ran with the animal for a few paces, murmuring to it in his own language, and its frantic plunging subsided into a trembling, shuddering halt. The entire event had taken less than 10 seconds. The boy's mother ran into the street and snatched her child, burying his face in her skirt. She looked at Taza, her mouth open to speak, a torrent of gratitude and relief in her eyes. But the words never came, because at that moment, Lieutenant Abel Crow and a squad of 6 soldiers marched around the corner of the fort. They were not responding to the commotion. They were on a mission, and ahead of them, they prodded a small group of Chiricahua people. There was an old man, his face a beautiful, intricate map of wrinkles, his back straight as a pine. There was a young woman with a baby strapped to her cradle board. There were 2 men, their faces impassive, their dark eyes missing nothing. They were not in chains, but the soldiers flanking them with rifles at the ready made any form of restraint unnecessary. "We have some questions for them about the train robbery," Lieutenant Crow announced to the silent street, his voice ringing with self-importance. "A routine inquiry." The woman with the child, who had been about to thank Taza, simply stared. The gratitude on her face curdled into the same suspicion and fear that marked every other face in the street. She pulled her son tighter and hurried away without a word. Taza stood alone beside the trembling horse, the hero of one moment, and in the next, just another Apache in the eyes of the town. He watched the soldiers march his people toward the fort stockade, and his face was a mask of stone. But Eleanor saw a muscle jump in his jaw, a flicker of profound and ancient grief in his eyes. In that instant, everything became clear to her. The law Silas Vane spoke of was a weapon. The justice Lieutenant Crow pursued was a lie. Her deed, her home, her future. It was all tied up in the same knot of greed and prejudice that was now tightening around Taza's people. Her only hope lay in the truth, and the truth was somewhere out in the wilderness, in the canyons where the men with the black spur brand had vanished. She found Taza later, as dusk was bleeding purple and orange across the sky. He was by the creek bed with his horses, checking their hooves, his movements deliberate and focused. The air had cooled, and the scent of dust was mixed with the smell of horse and dry grass. She walked up to him, her own boots making soft sounds in the sandy soil. He did not look up, but she knew he was aware of her. "They say the men who robbed the train rode for the Arroyo Seco," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Taza continued his work, running a hand down the leg of a pinto mare. "The land is full of liars," he said without looking at her. "Men and rocks." "My land deed was in that safe," she said. "The railroad wants my property. They offered me a pittance for it today. In a month, the court will give it to them for free." He finally stopped and looked at her. His eyes were dark and deep, and she had the feeling he was seeing not just her, but the entire history of loss and theft that had brought them both to this dry creek bed at the edge of a dying day. "This is a white man's trouble," he said.
"They are blaming your people for it,"
she countered.
"The lieutenant is not just asking questions. He is making a cage. You helped that boy today. You saved him,
and not one person, not even his mother, could thank you because they were too busy staring at the color of your skin." A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the whisper of the evening wind and the soft stamp of a horse's hoof. "I want to find that mail pouch," Eleanor said, her voice gaining strength. "I want to find the proof of who I am and what is mine. And I want to find the men who did this so they cannot hide behind your people. I cannot pay you much, but I need a guide. I need you to take me." Taza looked away from her, toward the darkening mesas. He saw the ghosts of his ancestors in those shapes. He heard their warnings on the wind. To help this woman was to step out of the shadows where he had found a fragile safety. It was to make himself a target for men like Crow and Vane. But to do nothing was to watch the cage be built, to accept the lie. He looked back at her, at the stubborn set of her jaw, at the honest fear and desperate resolve in her eyes. He saw a fellow creature, trapped and fighting. "The tracks will be cold," he said. "The wind covers everything." "Then we will look for what the wind cannot cover," she replied. He gave a slow, single nod. They made their preparations in secret, packing jerky and hardtack and filling canteens from Eleanor's well. They would ride under the cover of darkness. As they led their horses toward the little used trail that led west out of town, a figure stepped out of the deep shadows of the blacksmith's shop. "That is far enough," a sharp voice commanded. Lieutenant Crow stood before them, 2 soldiers flanking him. His face was unreadable in the moonlight, but his voice was tight with authority. "I have given orders that no Apache is to leave Mesquite Crossing," he said, his gaze fixed on Taza. "The investigation is ongoing. Your presence may be required." "It is my business where I go," Taza said, his voice a low rumble. Crow took a step forward. "In this town, your business is my business. Go back to your hut, and you, Mrs. Hart, I would advise you to be more careful in the company you keep." Eleanor opened her mouth to protest, to argue, but the cold, final certainty in the lieutenant's voice stopped her. There was no reasoning with him. Defeated. They turned back. The town, which had felt like a home, now felt like a prison. As they were unsaddling the horses in the dark, another man emerged from the shadows. He was older, his movements slow and deliberate. He wore a dusty vest with a tarnished star pinned to it. It was Deputy Jake Rowan, a man who had been keeping the peace in this territory since before Lieutenant Crow was born. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "That young lieutenant," he said, his voice a gravelly whisper. "All polish and no spine. He is so busy trying to look like the law, he has forgotten what it is for." He looked from Eleanor's determined face to Taza's stony one. "There is a game trail that follows the creek south for 2 miles before it cuts west," he said. "It comes out behind the red cliffs. No one ever uses it. I have to make a patrol out to the old mission tonight. I might get delayed. I might not be back before dawn." He did not wait for a reply. He simply tipped his hat and melted back into the darkness. Eleanor looked at Taza. A new, fragile thread of hope had been spun in the night. The law of men like Crow had blocked their path, but the quiet decency of a man like Rowan had just opened a new one. The game trail was less a path and more a suggestion. It followed the ghost of the creek bed, a whisper of a trail marked by broken twigs and the faintest depression in the sandy soil. Taza moved through the darkness with a quiet confidence that was its own form of light, his horses following without a sound. Eleanor rode behind him, the initial fear of being caught replaced by the immense, overwhelming reality of the landscape. The moon was a sliver, and the stars were a cold, brilliant fire scattered across a blackness so complete it felt like the beginning of the world. The air was thin and sharp, and the cold seeped through her coat, a deep, penetrating chill that had nothing to do with the temperature and everything to do with the profound emptiness of the land. By dawn, they had cleared the red cliffs that loomed over Mesquite Crossing. When the sun finally crested the horizon, it brought no warmth, only a harsh, revealing light. The world was a study in brown and red, a vast, cracked canvas stretching to infinity. The silence was absolute. Taza stopped, dismounted, and studied the ground, his body a fluid line of concentration. He was not looking at the ground so much as reading it, his eyes tracing a story written in dust and stone that was invisible to her. He pointed. A single set of tracks. A lone rider. From 2 nights ago. A soldier. By the look of the horse's gait. Lieutenant Crow's patrol. Taza's expression was unreadable, but Eleanor understood. They were not free. They were merely ahead. The day became a trial by fire. The sun climbed, bleaching the sky to a pale, hazy blue, and the heat pressed down. A physical weight. The water in her canteen, so cool and fresh hours before, was now warm and tasted of metal. Thirst became a constant companion, a dry, rasping presence in the back of her throat. They spoke little. Words were an extravagance the heat did not allow. Instead, a different kind of language grew between them, a language of shared necessity. When her horse stumbled, Taza was there, running a hand down its leg, his touch firm and knowing. When the sun beat down on the back of her neck, he produced a strip of cloth from his saddlebag and showed her how to wet it and tie it for some small relief. Their survival was a shared task, a quiet partnership forged in the crucible of the desert. Late in the afternoon of the second day, Taza found what he was looking for. He dismounted in a wide, flat basin where the wind had less power. Here, sheltered by a low ridge of rock, the story of the robbers was written more clearly. He pointed to the scuffed, chaotic tracks of a dozen horses. Shod horses, he said, his voice a low rasp. Iron shoes. My people do not shoe their horses for this country. It makes them lame. He then pointed to a deeper set of parallel lines. The ruts of a heavy wagon. Too heavy for a prospector, it carried weight. He followed the tracks, his eyes scanning every detail. He stopped and knelt, picking up a small, dark object. An empty can of beans. He turned it over in his hand. More white man's trouble, he murmured. The tracks led them west, toward a deep gash in the earth, the dry canyon known as Arroyo Seco. The name was fitting. It was a place of rock and shadow, its walls carved by water that no longer flowed. The air in the arroyo was still and oven-hot. Following the trail into its winding depths felt like descending into a trap. They found the campsite easily. It was tucked under an overhang, a place where a fire would not be seen from the rim. The ashes were cold, but not old. The ground was littered with more cans, discarded bits of leather, and the husks of spent ammunition. Eleanor watched as Taza moved through the site, his focus absolute. He was a hunter, and this was his element. He picked up one of the spent cartridge casings, holding it in his palm. He rolled it over, and then his body went still. He held it out for her to see. On the flat brass base of the casing was a tiny, stamped image. It was not a number or a letter. It was a perfect, miniature spur. The wind that always seemed to blow in the high country was absent here, but Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine. The Black Spur Gang. It was their sign, their name, left here in the dust. This was proof. Hard. Physical proof that the robbers were not Apache. It was a piece of the truth, small and solid in her hand.
But what good is a piece of truth if no one will look at it?
She asked, her voice echoing slightly against the canyon walls. Taza slipped the casing into a small leather pouch at his belt.
The truth is a seed,
he said. It needs the right ground to grow. He knew where that ground might be. Leaving the arroyo, they rode north into a more broken country of twisted junipers and balancing rocks. It was a land designed for hiding. He led her to a hidden camp, a collection of brush shelters so skillfully blended into the landscape they were nearly invisible until they were upon them. A man emerged from one of the shelters, a rifle held loosely in his hands. He was younger than Taza, his face leaner, his eyes holding a restless, fiery light. "Eshkin," Taza said, "my cousin." Eshkin's eyes flickered from Taza to Eleanor, his gaze wary and laced with suspicion. He and Taza spoke in their own language, the words a mix of soft vowels and sharp consonants. Eleanor could not understand the words, but she could read the conflict in their tones. Taza was calm, reasoned. Eshkin was sharp, resistant. "He asks why you bring this woman here," Taza translated, his eyes still on his cousin. "He says we have found survival in being ghosts. To speak in the white man's world is to invite the soldiers." "Tell him the soldiers are coming anyway," Eleanor said, finding her voice. "They have already made their cage. This is the only key that might unlock it." Taza translated. Eshkin listened, his gaze fixed on her. He looked at the pouch at Taza's belt, where the spur casing lay. He gave a short, bitter laugh and said something that needed no translation. It was the sound of a man who had seen too many promises broken. He shook his head and retreated back into the shadows of his shelter. A silent, final refusal. The ground here was barren. The seed would not grow. Taza's face was grim as they rode away. "He carries the memory of the long walk," he said quietly. "When they moved our people from the mountains, he does not believe in keys. He only believes in walls. There was one more place, a small, crumbling adobe mission that stood alone in a vast, empty plain, a monument to a faith that had long since retreated. An old woman in the brown robes of a nun met them at the gate. Her face was as wrinkled as a dried apple, but her eyes were clear and intelligent. Madre Lupe. She listened patiently as Eleanor told her story, her hands busy shelling peas into a wooden bowl. Taza stood by the door, a silent, watchful guardian. When Eleanor finished, the old nun nodded slowly. "Men are a storm," she said, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "They blow in with much noise and leave much wreckage behind." She remembered the men Eleanor described. "A hard lot." She said, "They passed 2 days before the robbery. They had a heavy wagon. They were in a great hurry." She stood up and went to a heavy wooden desk. She opened a thick, leather-bound ledger. It was her station journal, a meticulous record of every traveler, every transaction, every notable event. She ran a finger down the page. "Here," she said, 12 riders and a wagon. Paid for water and grain with new banknotes. Heading east. The date and time were recorded in a neat, precise hand. She looked at Eleanor. "This book has recorded much sadness." She said, "Perhaps it is time it recorded a little justice. You may use it as you need." As they prepared to leave, the setting sun painting the clouds in fiery strokes, Eleanor felt a profound shift inside her. The piece of paper that represented her deed had been her anchor, but it was just a symbol. The true foundation, she was beginning to see, was not built on paper, but on the courage of a man who would not bend, on the quiet integrity of an old woman and her book, on the hard, undeniable truth of a tiny brass spur. Her faith was moving, away from the faceless system that Silas Vane controlled, and toward the quiet strength of the man who rode beside her. The world was still a dangerous place. The wind still blew with the grit of prejudice, but for the first time since the train was robbed, she felt she was walking on solid ground. As they rode out from the mission, Taza suddenly reined in his horse, his head cocked, listening. Far to the south, a faint plume of dust rose against the darkening sky. A single rider, moving fast. The seed was in their possession. But the storm was following. The plume of dust on the horizon was not a casual traveler. Taza knew its language. It spoke of a horse being pushed hard, of a rider with an urgent purpose, a scout. He reined in his mount, his body a study in stillness. His eyes narrowed against the glare. The rider was still miles away, a mere speck, but the dust was a clear signal against the bruised purple of the evening sky. A storm was coming, both from the heavens and from the world of men.
"We change course," he said, his voice low and certain. "The main trail is a trap waiting to be set. We will take the old freight road. It is harder, but it will take us over the deep canyon. Few men use it."
Eleanor did not question him. She had seen the dust cloud too, and she felt the same cold premonition. The quiet partnership of the desert had become an unspoken alliance. She trusted his instincts as she trusted the sun to rise. They turned their horses northwest, toward a line of jagged hills that clawed at the darkening sky. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain and a palpable sense of menace. It was a lonely, desperate race against the coming darkness and the approaching rider. They reached the canyon by the last light of a failed day. The bridge was a skeleton of sun-bleached timbers stretched across a chasm that fell away into deep shadow. It was an old structure, built for heavy ore wagons that no longer ran, and it moaned under the rising wind. The creek bed below was a broad, stony expanse, dry as a bone, littered with the smooth, pale trunks of long dead cottonwoods. Their horses hesitated at the edge, snorting nervously at the groaning wood and the dizzying drop. Taza dismounted and ran his hands over the thick timbers where they were set into the rock. He tested them with his weight. "It will hold," he said, though his voice lacked complete conviction. "But we must cross one at a time, and we must be quick. The storm is close." He led his horse onto the bridge first. The hooves made a hollow, echoing sound, a lonely drumbeat against the rising shriek of the wind. Each step seemed to take an eternity. Eleanor watched, her hands clenched on her own reins, her knuckles white. He reached the other side and turned, raising a hand in an all-clear signal. It was her turn. She nudged her horse forward, her heart pounding in time with the wooden clatter beneath her. The animal was tense, its ears twitching, its every muscle coiled to bolt. She focused on Taza, a solid, reassuring figure on the far side, ignoring the terrifying emptiness below. She was halfway across when the world exploded in a crack of sound and a splinter of wood. A rifle shot. A bullet whined past her head, and a chunk of the handrail beside her disintegrated in a shower of pale splinters. Her horse screamed and reared, its iron-shod hooves skittering on the slick planks. She fought for control, pulling hard on the reins, trying to soothe the panicked animal with her voice. From the canyon rim, a muzzle flashed again, then another. They were trapped. Figures appeared on both sides of the chasm, men with rifles, their forms dark against the last vestiges of twilight. The Black Spur Gang. They had been waiting. "Ride!" Taza's voice boomed, cutting through the wind and the panic. "Do not stop!" Eleanor dug her heels into the horse's flanks. The animal leaped forward, a frantic, desperate gallop across the groaning bridge. Bullets kicked up splinters around them. She could hear the shouts of the men, the thunder of Taza's horse as he rode back onto the bridge to meet her, to give her covering fire. The air was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the ozone scent of the coming rain. The sweat of her horse was a slick, hot film against her legs. They were not just shooting at them. They were shooting at the bridge itself. A heavy-caliber slug tore into one of the main support posts near the far side, the impact echoing like a cannon shot. The entire structure shuddered violently. Eleanor heard a deep, guttural groan from the timbers beneath her, the sound of a giant beast in its death throes. Taza reached her, grabbing her horse's bridle. "Go!" he yelled, his face a mask of grim determination in the flashes of gunfire. He fired his own pistol back at the rim, a small, defiant answer to the rifle fire. Another volley of shots slammed into the bridge supports. The wooden planks beneath them buckled. A great, tearing scream of tortured wood filled the air, and the section of the bridge in front of them simply vanished, plunging into the darkness. Her horse screamed, its front legs scrambling at the empty air. For a terrible, heart-stopping second, it balanced on the precipice, and then it fell. Eleanor was thrown clear, her body tumbling through the air. She had a fleeting, surreal vision of the dark canyon walls rushing up to meet her,
and then she hit the stony creek bed with a force that drove the air from her lungs. Pain, sharp and blinding, shot through her side. She lay gasping, the world a dizzying, spinning vortex of black and gray, and then the heavens opened. The rain did not fall. It was a furious, blinding sheet of water that hit the ground with the force of a physical blow. The dry creek bed, a place that had not seen water in months, was transformed in seconds. A trickle became a stream, the stream a rushing current, and the current a roaring, muddy torrent. The flash flood, a monster born of cloudburst and gravity, surged down the canyon, seizing her, pulling her, tumbling her over the smooth, unforgiving rocks. She fought against it, her arms flailing, but the water was too strong, an irresistible force. Her head went under. Her lungs burned. She was drowning in the middle of the desert. Just as the blackness began to close in, something snagged her. A rope, a lasso, tightening around her chest and under her arms. She was pulled upward, her head breaking the surface. She took a huge, ragged gasp of air. Taza! He was on the bank, somehow safe, his horse standing firm as he leaned back against the rope, his muscles straining as he hauled her from the murderous current. He dragged her onto the relative safety of a high ledge. Out of the main force of the flood, she collapsed onto the wet sand, coughing up water and mud, her body a single, throbbing ache. The floodwaters roared past them, carrying the massive timbers of the shattered bridge like twigs. The rain was already lessening, the fury of the storm passing as quickly as it had arrived. They found shelter in a shallow cave carved into the canyon wall, a space just big enough to escape the last of the rain. Taza gathered what dry brush he could find, and with a skill that seemed like magic, coaxed a small, sputtering fire to life. The flickering light pushed back the oppressive darkness and cast dancing shadows on the wet rock. Eleanor huddled by the flames, shivering uncontrollably from both cold and shock. "The mail pouch," she whispered, the words rasping in her throat. "It is gone. Everything is gone." Taza said nothing. He simply held out his hand. In his palm, catching the firelight, lay a small, circular object of dark red wax. It was caked with mud, but the image pressed into it was still clear the official seal of the Territorial Land Office. It was caught on a mesquite branch. He said, "The pouch was torn. The papers are lost to the water, but this survived." Eleanor stared at it. It was a piece of the truth, a small, resilient fragment rescued from the chaos. It was not the deed itself, but it was proof the deed had existed. It was proof that a mail pouch carrying official documents had been on that bridge. It was something. But as he looked at the wax seal in his hand, Taza felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the rain. This was a piece of their world, a symbol of their law. Madre Lupe's journal, the spur casing, now this seal. They were collecting evidence, proof that would be undeniable in a just world, but he knew, with a certainty that went bone deep, that they were not heading back to a just world. Lieutenant Crow would not see evidence. He would see an Apache with a history, an Apache whose people were already under suspicion. Crow would twist his words, dismiss his testimony, use his past as a weapon to destroy his credibility. For a man like Crow, the truth was irrelevant. The only thing that mattered was the story he wanted to tell. He fell into a grim silence, the weight of this realization pressing down on him. All this risk, all this danger, and for what? To present proof that would be thrown out of court because of the color of his skin. Eleanor watched him, saw the conflict in his eyes. The firelight carved deep shadows on his face, highlighting the exhaustion and the sudden, profound despair. She had seen his courage on the bridge, his strength in pulling her from the flood, and now she saw the wound he carried inside, the invisible scar left by a world that had judged him long before he had ever spoken a word. She reached out and put her hand on his arm. His muscles were tense, hard as rock. She did not pull her hand away. In the quiet of the cave, with the sound of the receding floodwaters echoing in the canyon, she felt the last of her old certainties fall away. The law would not save her. The system would not protect her. All she had was this man, this quiet, capable, wounded man who had risked everything for her. He looked at her, his dark eyes questioning. She took the reins of her own horse, which he had managed to save, and held them out to him. The gesture was small, but the meaning was immense. "I am placing my life and my home in your hands," she said, her voice clear and steady in the firelit dark. Taza looked at the worn leather reins in her outstretched hands. It was more than the control of a horse. It was an offering of complete trust, an act of faith that crossed the canyon of race and prejudice that separated their worlds. In that moment, he was no longer just a guide, and she was no longer just a client. They were partners, bound by a shared enemy and a desperate, fragile hope. He took the reins. The seed of truth they carried was not enough. They would have to find a way to make the ground ready to receive it. The fire was a pile of graying embers when dawn broke, a cold and indifferent light that filled the canyon. Eleanor awoke to a body that catalogued its pains with a brutal honesty. Every muscle ached, and a deep bruise on her side throbbed with each breath. Taza was already awake, standing at the mouth of the small cave, a silhouette against the pale morning. He was watching the sky, reading the clouds, his stillness a stark contrast to the violent chaos of the night before. They ate a meager breakfast of cold jerky, the silence between them thick with unspoken realities. They had survived, but survival was not victory. Eleanor held the muddy wax seal in her hand, its weight both a comfort and a burden. "It is proof," she said, her voice hoarse, along with the cartridge and Madre Lupe's journal. "It is enough." Taza turned from the light, his face carved with a weariness that went deeper than a single sleepless night. "Enough for who?" he asked. "The law is a story. The man who tells the best story wins. The lieutenant already has his story. He will say, 'I am a thief who stole this from a dead man's pouch.' He will say my past proves I am a liar. He will hold up my life and say, 'Look, this is not a man to be trusted.' And the men on the jury, they will not, because it is the story they already believe." The simple, brutal truth of his words settled in the cold air between them. Her evidence, their entire desperate journey, was meaningless if the man presenting it was condemned before he even spoke. She saw the trap not just for her, but for him. To speak was to invite ruin. To stay silent was to let the lie stand and lose her home. Back in Mesquite Crossing, a different kind of story was being carefully crafted. Silas Vane sat in the spare, rigid office of Lieutenant Abel Crow. The room smelled of polish and stale authority. Crow stood by the window, his back ramrod straight, staring out at the dusty parade ground where his soldiers drilled under a merciless sun. He was a man consumed by the need for action, an ambition so raw it was a kind of hunger. "Your men have found nothing," Vane stated. It was not a question. Crow's jaw tightened. The trail was washed out by the storm. "My scout lost them." He turned from the window, his eyes burning with frustration. "I know they are out there. I have the Chiricahua families confined to their camp, but I have no cause to search their homes. No definitive proof to act upon." Vane smiled his smooth, predatory smile. "Perhaps I can be of assistance. Lieutenant, proof can be a difficult thing to acquire, sometimes. It must be found by fortunate circumstance." He reached into the inner pocket of his immaculate coat and produced a small object wrapped in deerskin. He placed it gently on Crow's desk. "One of my surveyors discovered this near the tracks, not far from the robbery," he said, his voice a confidential murmur. "He thought it was a rock, but he brought it to me. I believe it is what you people call a medicine pouch." Crow unwrapped the deerskin. Inside lay a small, beaded leather pouch, intricately stitched with the design of a striking hawk. It was undeniably Apache. It was also undeniably old, the leather soft with age, the beads worn smooth. "This could have been dropped at any time," Crow said, though his eyes were fixed on the pouch. his hunger growing. Of course, Vane agreed easily, but in a court of opinion, Lieutenant, which is where your reputation will be made. Timing is everything. A wise man once said that opportunity does not knock. It presents itself to those who are ready to see it. He let the silence stretch, allowing Crow to connect the dots himself. An ambitious officer, a restless command, a notorious gang of Apache robbers. And now, a piece of physical evidence. It was a perfect story. All it required was a teller with enough conviction. Crow picked up the pouch. His fingers closed around it, a gesture of ownership, of decision. "Thank you for your civic-mindedness, Mr. Vane," he said, his voice flat and official. "I will see that this is logged as evidence immediately." He issued an order for a full search of the Chiricahua camp. Vane nodded, the perfect picture of a concerned citizen. The handshake between power and prejudice was complete. Miles away, Eleanor and Taza found a sheltered spot to rest their horses and themselves. The reality of their situation had settled upon them. Taza was right. Their proof was a key for a lock that did not exist. As he tended to the horses, Eleanor sat with her back against a sun-warmed rock, her mind racing. She thought of the men in town, the ranchers and shopkeepers, men like Henderson, the stagecoach driver, or Mr. Abernathy, the blacksmith. They were honest men, mostly. They were also afraid of the railroad, afraid of losing what little they had. Vane was counting on that fear. He was using it to divide them. "That is his power," she said aloud, more to herself than to Taza. "He makes everyone feel alone." Taza paused, looking at her. "He is a spider," he said. "He spins a web of paper and promises." "Then we need to break the web," she replied, a new energy rising in her. "We cannot fight him with just one piece of truth. We need a truth that is bigger. We need all the other people he is threatening." She thought of the stockmen's associations she had read about, groups of ranchers who banded together to set prices and protect their interests. We need our own association, a mesquite association, a petition, a document signed by every man and woman Vane is trying to cheat. We will build a wall of names, a story of our own that the court cannot ignore. Taza looked at her, a flicker of something new in his eyes. It was not hope, not yet, but a grudging respect. "You are learning," he said. "Your paper is a weapon only if you have enough of it." "But first," he said, turning his gaze toward a distant, sacred line of red rock canyons, "I must speak to my own council. To go to your court is to put my people in the path of the storm. I will not do that without the blessing of the old ones. It is a risk I must ask them to share." They rode toward the red canyons, a place that felt older than time itself. The rock rose in sheer, sculpted walls, the color of a freshly bled heart. It was a silent, holy place. At the entrance to a narrow canyon, an old man sat by a small, smokeless fire. His face was a testament to 100 years of sun and wind, his eyes deep and knowing. This was Dasodahai, the elder. Taza spoke to him for a long time in the Chiricahua language. He told of the robbery, the false blame, the evidence they had found. He spoke of Eleanor's fight and of the trap that awaited him in the white man's court. He laid out the two paths, the path of silence, which was the path of safety and continued injustice, and the path of speaking, which was the path of great danger and a small chance for truth. Dasodahai listened without interruption. When Taza finished, the old man stared into the heart of the red canyon for a long time. "The silence is a heavy blanket," he finally said, his voice like the scrape of stone on stone. "It keeps you warm, but it also suffocates you. The stories of our people are carved on these rocks. If we do not speak our own story now, they will come and carve a false one over it. You must speak, but you must do it with the wisdom of the canyon, not the anger of the storm." The blessing was given. The choice was made. As they prepared to leave, Taza walked to a massive, smooth wall of red sandstone that glowed in the afternoon light. It was a solid, impenetrable face.
like a heart that had been closed against a world of pain. He picked up a piece of charcoal from an ancient fire pit. With a slow, deliberate motion, he drew a single, dark line across the face of the stone. It was not a mark of anger or of desecration. It was a gesture of profound significance. He was opening a door. He was opening his heart. But he would not forget the scars. He was opening the story of his people to the world. But he would keep the memory of all they had suffered. Eleanor watched him, and in that simple act, she understood the depth of his sacrifice. He was willing to risk everything, not for her land, but for the chance to break the cycle of lies that had imprisoned his people for generations. As they turned their horses back toward the trail, a figure appeared, running toward them from the east. It was a young boy from the Chiricahua camp, his face streaked with tears and dust, his breathing coming in ragged sobs. He stumbled to a halt before Taza, gasping out his message in their own language. Eleanor did not need a translation. She could see the devastation in the boy's eyes, and in the sudden, terrible stillness that came over Taza. His face became a mask of cold fury, all the careful control gone, replaced by the raw pain of a fresh wound. "Soldiers," Taza said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "The lieutenant came to the camp. He said he had proof. He tore our homes apart. They took the men. They are all in the fort stockade. Eshkin is with them." The cage was no longer a threat. It was a reality. The story Vane and Crow had written was now being enacted with rifles and steel, and Taza's people were paying the price. The news brought by the young boy was a spark in a powder keg. Taza's grief hardened instantly into a cold, diamond-hard fury. He moved with a terrifying new purpose. His previous caution burned away by the outrage. Eleanor saw in him the warrior he had been forced to suppress, a man pushed past the limits of endurance. They could not go back. To return to the camp was to walk into Crow's waiting arms. To ride for Mesquite Crossing was suicide. They were fugitives now, hunted in their own land. They rode hard into the broken country, a maze of gullies and sharp-edged mesas where a pursuit would be difficult. A patrol of soldiers, sent out by Crow to sweep the area for Taza, confirmed their fears. They heard the distant sound of shod horses on rock and were forced into a desperate, scrambling flight down a steep wash, their own mounts sliding and stumbling on the loose scree. They hid in a thicket of salt cedar, their hearts hammering against their ribs. As the patrol passed less than 100 yards away, the soldiers' casual laughter and the jingle of their gear was an obscene sound in the tense silence. They were not just enforcing the law. They were on a hunt, and Taza was the quarry. When night fell, they were deep in the Badlands, exhausted and emotionally raw. The moon rose, a pale, scarred disk in the vast, indifferent sky, casting a ghostly silver light over the landscape. They found a small, sheltered hollow at the base of a mesa, a place where a single, ancient mesquite tree grew, its gnarled branches reaching out like protective arms. Its leaves, delicate and feathery, filtered the moonlight, creating a shifting lacework of shadow on the ground. Taza unsaddled the horses, his movements economical and precise, but Eleanor could see the tension coiled in his shoulders, the profound weariness in the set of his jaw. The fire of his rage had banked, leaving behind the cold ashes of a deep and terrible sorrow. He was a man carrying the weight of his entire people, and she felt a wave of helplessness wash over her. Her own troubles, her fight for her small piece of land, seemed insignificant in the face of his loss. She built a small, smokeless fire from dry mesquite twigs, its low flames providing a small circle of warmth against the encroaching chill of the desert night. They sat on opposite sides of it, the silence stretching between them, filled with the quiet chirping of crickets and the whisper of the wind through the mesquite leaves. "My husband, Samuel," she said softly, her voice startling in the quiet. "He is buried not far from here." She looked out into the moonlit emptiness. He loved this land. He believed it held a promise. He dug for silver,
But I think he was really digging for a future, a place where we could be safe. She pulled her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders. When he was gone, I think I was buried with him in a way. I built a wall around myself. Duty, the post office, the children's lessons. They were all just bricks in the wall. I thought if I kept busy enough, if I followed all the rules, I could not be hurt again. I thought the law would keep me safe. Taza looked at her from across the fire, his dark eyes reflecting the tiny flames. He saw the truth of her words, the quiet grief she had carried for so long, a burden as heavy in its own way as his own. Safety is a memory, he said, his voice a low murmur. I remember a time when our people did not fear the sound of a horse in the night. I remember the faces of my father and my uncle. They were taken in a raid, just like this one. Not for a crime, but for being who they were. Their faces are with me when I sleep. The story of my people is a long walk away from all that we held dear. To survive, you learn to live in the shadows. You learn to be quiet. You build your own walls. He looked down at his hands. Strong, capable hands that could gentle a wild horse or find water where there was none. But the memories made them feel useless. Eleanor felt a profound connection to him in that moment, a recognition that transcended their different worlds. Their pain was not the same, but it came from the same deep well of human loss. He was trapped by the memory of a past that had been stolen, and she was trapped by the fear of a future that felt impossible. She moved around the small fire and sat beside him, not touching, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body. The air was filled with the sweet, dusty scent of the mesquite. "I was so afraid," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Afraid of losing my home, afraid of being alone again. But being with you, seeing what they have done to your people. To Eshkin, my fear feels so small now. It feels selfish. It is just another brick in the wall, and I'm tired of living inside it." She looked at him, her eyes shining in the moonlight, filled with a raw and courageous vulnerability. She took a shuddering breath, the words coming from a place deeper than thought, a place of pure, desperate need. "Break me open," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Do not let fear lock me in anymore." The plea hung in the cool night air, a fragile and incredibly brave offering. It was a request not for passion, but for release. It was a prayer to be taught how to feel again, how to live outside the fortress of her own grief. Taza turned his head and looked at her. He saw not a frightened widow, but a woman of immense strength, a woman who had walked into the desert to fight for her life and was now willing to walk into the even more terrifying landscape of her own heart. He saw a spirit that refused to be broken. He slowly reached out and covered her hand with his. His palm was calloused and warm, a stark contrast to her own, which was trembling slightly. The touch was not one of possession, but of profound and gentle acceptance. He did not speak for a long time, his gaze holding hers, a silent conversation passing between them that was more intimate than any words could be. The world he came from, the world that had shaped him, was one of violence and taking, land, lives, freedom. They were things that were taken by force. He had spent his life resisting that brutal logic, preserving what little he could in the quiet spaces. He leaned closer, the scent of wood smoke and dust and the clean, wild scent of the man himself filling her senses. Their shared breath plumed in the cool air. He saw the trust in her eyes, a trust so complete it was a sacred thing. "I do not take," he said, his voice a solemn vow, a promise that sealed the space between them. "I preserve." In that instant, the alliance that had been forged in desperation and shared danger was transformed. They were no longer just a guide in his charge, no longer just two allies fighting a common enemy. The walls they had both built, one of fear and one of memory, crumbled in the quiet sanctity of the mesquite hollow. He was not just fighting for her land, and she was not just fighting for his people's justice. They were now fighting for each other, for the fragile, beautiful, and courageous future they had just chosen to build together.
The moonlight streamed through the leaves, and for the first time in a very long time, neither of them felt alone. The trial was held in the saloon. The long bar was draped in canvas to hide the whiskey bottles, a futile gesture that did nothing to mask the stale smell of beer and desperation. A traveling judge, a man with a weary face and a gavel that looked too heavy for his hand, presided from a makeshift bench. The jury, a collection of men Eleanor knew to be in Silas Vane's debt or in his pocket, sat stiffly on a row of chairs, their eyes avoiding hers. The air was thick with the red dust that filtered through the walls and the even thicker dust of prejudice. The day's heat was suffocating. Lieutenant Abel Crow was the first to present his case. He stood straight and proud in his immaculate blue uniform, his voice ringing with the absolute certainty of a man who has never questioned his own righteousness. He presented the beaded medicine pouch, holding it up for the jury to see as if it were a smoking gun. Found near the scene, he declared, a clear marker of the guilty party. Then he called his witness, a shifty, nervous man with sweat stains under his arms, whom Eleanor had seen taking Vane's money a few days prior. The man swore on a Bible that he had seen a band of Apaches, led by Taza, riding hard away from the train tracks on the morning of the robbery. His lies were clumsy, his gaze darting around the room, but in the hostile climate of the saloon, they were potent enough. Silas Vane sat beside his lawyer, a faint, satisfied smile playing on his lips. The web was drawing tight, while the law, twisted and corrupted, played out in town. A different kind of drama unfolded on the sun-scorched plains to the west. A small wagon train of 3 settler families, lured by the railroad's promises of fertile land, was making its slow way toward Mesquite Crossing. They were a vulnerable target, a symbol of the very people Vane claimed to be protecting. From a high ridge, the Black Spur Gang watched them, their leader a burly man with a cruel twist to his mouth. The orders from Vane had been simple: create chaos, remind the people what they had to fear, remind them who they needed to keep them safe. As the gang prepared to descend, a movement on another ridge caught their attention. 2 riders, their figures lean and unmistakable against the sky. They were Chiricahua. The riders sat their horses for a moment, a deliberate and open challenge, before turning and galloping away. The leader of the Black Spur Gang laughed. It was a perfect opportunity, a chance to run down some real Apaches and be hailed as heroes for it. He barked an order, and the entire gang gave chase, abandoning the wagon train for the more exciting prospect of a hunt. The 2 riders were Eshkin and another young warrior, released from the stockade by Deputy Jake Rowan in a quiet act of subversion. Their flight was not one of fear. It was a lure, drawing the wolf pack into a trap of their own, making a narrow, winding canyon known for the way the sky could turn on you in an instant. Thunder Canyon. Back in the saloon, it was Eleanor's turn. She stood, her hands clasped in front of her to still their trembling. She did not look at the jury. She looked at the faces in the crowd, at the ranchers and the blacksmith and the freight driver. "The law is meant to protect us all," she began, her voice quiet but clear. "But it is not just a book of rules. It is a promise we make to each other, to be fair and honest. Mr. Vane and his railroad have broken that promise." She then presented Madre Lupe's journal, reading the entry about the 12 riders and their heavy wagon. She held up the battered wax seal. "This is the seal from the land office. It was on a mail pouch that was on that bridge." She finally held up the small brass casing with the spur stamped into its base. "And this is the mark of the men who truly robbed the train. But I did not come here today just to plead my own case," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "I came to speak for Mesquite Crossing." She turned and gestured to the crowd. "Mr. Abernathy, Mr. Henderson, stand with me." One by one, more than a dozen men and women rose to their feet, a silent, powerful human wall. She unrolled a long sheet of paper. "This is a petition," she declared, her voice ringing in the stunned silence. "It is the charter for the Mesquite Settlers Association. We have all signed it. It states that we will no longer be intimidated. We will sell our land at a fair price, decided by us, not by a syndicate from the east. We will stand together." The judge stared, his mouth slightly agape. Vane's smile had vanished, replaced by a mask of cold fury. Before he could object, Deputy Jake Rowan took the stand. He did not look at Vane or Crow. He addressed the judge. "Your Honor," he said in his gravelly, no-nonsense voice, "I have been a lawman in this territory for 20 years. I have seen my share of schemes. I ran a check on the telegram wire last night. The company Mr. Vane represents, the Western Land Syndicate, has had its charter revoked by the territorial government for fraudulent practices. Legally speaking, any contract he offers is worthless. As for the lieutenant's witness, I happen to know for a fact he was in my jail for being drunk and disorderly on the morning of the robbery." A gasp went through the room. The foundation of Vane and Crow's case had just been shattered by the simple, unassailable truth. The chase in the canyon was fast and brutal. Eshkin and his companion were superb horsemen, leading the Black Spur gang deeper and deeper into the winding stone labyrinth. The sky above, which had been a clear, hard blue, was now turning a bruised and ugly gray. A low rumble of thunder echoed off the high canyon walls. As the gang rounded a sharp bend, they were met by a single rider who blocked the narrow passage. It was Taza. He sat his horse, a Winchester rifle resting easy in his arms, his face a mask of cold, implacable purpose. The gang leader pulled his horse to a skidding halt. "Well, look what we have here," he sneered. "The big chief himself." Before he could say more, a rifle shot cracked from the rim of the canyon above. One of the gang members cried out and slumped in his saddle. Eshkin and his companion had circled back. The hunters were now the hunted. At that moment, Lieutenant Crow arrived at the mouth of the canyon, leading a posse of a half-dozen deputized townsmen. He had heard the news of the wagon train attack and had ridden out, desperate for his moment of glory. He saw the scene before him, Taza and the Chiricahua riders, guns in hand, and the Black Spur gang, caught in the middle. His mind, blinded by ambition and prejudice, saw only one story. "There they are!" he screamed, his voice cracking with excitement. "It is an ambush! Fire at will!" He raised his own pistol and fired, not at the known outlaws of the Black Spur gang, but at Taza. The townsmen with him, confused but conditioned to follow orders, raised their own rifles. But in the chaotic moment, as Taza spurred his horse into cover, Crow fired again, wildly. The bullet went wide, ricocheting off the canyon wall. A man in Crow's own posse cried out and fell from his horse, clutching a bloody shoulder. The townsmen froze. They stared at the lieutenant, then at their fallen neighbor. They saw the mad light in Crow's eyes, the fanaticism that valued a headline over the life of one of his own men. In that instant, the lie that had held Mesquite Crossing in its grip was broken. They had been led not by a protector of the law, but by a dangerous fool. The sky opened up. A sudden violent torrent of rain and hail cascaded into the canyon, turning the dusty ground to slick mud and battering the men with ice. The thunder cracked directly overhead. A deafening explosion of sound. Horses panicked. The remaining members of the Black Spur gang, their nerve broken, scattered. In the chaos, the townsmen, led by the blacksmith Abernathy, surrounded their lieutenant. They took his gun. "Your command is over." "Crow!" Abernathy said, his voice shaking with rage. "You are under arrest." In the aftermath of the storm and the firefight, with the leader of the Black Spur gang captured, the truth finally came out. Faced with a hangman's noose, the outlaw confessed everything. "Vane hired us," he snarled. "He paid us to rob the train and make it look like an Apache raid, the attack on the wagons. All of it. It was all Vane." A rider, soaked to the skin and mud-spattered, galloped into a silent Mesquite Crossing. He burst into the saloon, where the trial had stalled in a state of confused suspense. He told his story, his words tumbling out in a rush. Crow's arrest, the battle in Thunder Canyon,
The confession. A collective roar went up from the crowd. All eyes turned to Silas Vane. His face was ashen, his composure utterly shattered. He was a spider whose web had been torn to pieces. The judge, his face a mixture of fear and relief, banged his gavel, his voice finally finding its strength. "This hearing is concluded," he declared. "Silas Vane, you are to be taken into custody to await trial for conspiracy and robbery." The sound of the gavel was like the thunder in the canyon, a final, definitive crack of judgment that washed the red dust of lies from the air. The silence that fell in the saloon after the rider's announcement was heavier than the oppressive heat. It was a silence of shock, of revelation, of a town staring at its own reflection and not liking what it saw. For a moment, Silas Vane remained frozen in his chair, the mask of composed civility still in place. But it was a brittle thing, cracking at the edges. His eyes, usually so cold and calculating, were wide with a kind of animal panic. The web was broken, and the spider was exposed. Deputy Jake Rowan moved with a deliberate, unhurried pace that was more menacing than any sudden action. He did not draw his gun. He did not need to. He simply stood before Vane, his shadow falling across the expensive suit. "Silas Vane," he said, his voice a low, gravelly sound that carried to every corner of the room. "By the authority of the Arizona Territory, you are under arrest." Vane's composure finally shattered. He stood up, knocking his chair over, his face a mottled red. "This is an outrage," he sputtered, his voice a high, reedy thing, a conspiracy. "You cannot do this." But the power had gone out of his words. He was no longer the voice of the future, the agent of progress. He was just a man in a dusty saloon, a liar whose lies had run out. Two of the townsmen, men who had feared him an hour before, stepped forward and took his arms. He did not struggle as they led him away. The smoothness was gone, and what was left was small and weak and sweating. A short time later, Lieutenant Abel Crow was marched into the room, his uniform streaked with mud, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. The posse of townsmen who had arrested him stood grimly behind him. The acting commander of the fort, a grizzled old captain who had seen enough of ambition to recognize its poison, stepped forward. "Lieutenant Crow," the captain said, his voice devoid of emotion, "you are hereby relieved of your command, pending a full court-martial for conduct unbecoming an officer, reckless endangerment, and conspiracy to subvert justice." He reached out and, with a sharp, practiced motion, unpinned the silver lieutenant's bars from Crow's collar and the insignia from his hat. The act was swift and brutal, a public stripping of the identity Crow had prized above all else. Without his rank, he was just a young man with hate in his eyes, his ambition now a ruin around his feet. He said nothing as he too was led away, a prisoner in the fort he had so recently commanded. The saloon slowly emptied, the people spilling out into the late afternoon sun, blinking as if waking from a long, bad dream. The air, washed clean by the storm, felt lighter. The oppressive weight of Vane's presence had lifted. The rest of the Black Spur gang, scattered and leaderless, were rounded up over the next few days, their reign of manufactured terror over. The following morning, the judge reconvened his court, not in the saloon, but in Eleanor's schoolhouse. The room was bright, filled with the scent of chalk dust and old paper, a place of learning, not of lies. With Vane's confession a matter of record, the legal proceedings were brief. The judge, his face showing a newfound clarity, declared all of Vane's land acquisition offers to be null and void due to their fraudulent basis. He then turned to Eleanor. "Mrs. Hart," he said, "and your association." He picked up the petition she had presented, reading the title aloud, the Mesquite Settlers Association. In light of the events, and the clear need for the citizens of this community to have a unified voice in their own affairs, this court recognizes this as a legitimate and legal entity. Your land claims, and those of your members, are hereby affirmed.
A wave of quiet, profound relief washed through the small group of settlers standing with Eleanor. It was more than a victory. It was a beginning. That afternoon, the association held its first official meeting. They elected the blacksmith, Abernathy, as their chairman. They passed their first 2 resolutions. The first was to establish a schedule of fair prices for land and water rights, ensuring that no outside syndicate could ever again try to pick them off one by one. The second, proposed by Eleanor, was to take up a collection. Every member contributed what they could, $1, a few coins, creating a small but significant fund, a legal defense fund, she called it, to make sure we always have the means to hire a lawyer who will speak for us, and not for the highest bidder. As the meeting concluded, a procession made its way from the fort. Deputy Rowan, his face set in a look of quiet satisfaction, walked at the head. Behind him were the Chiricahua men, including Eshkin, their faces impassive, but their eyes taking in the changed atmosphere of the town. They were not prisoners being marched to a stockade. They were free men walking in the light. Taza stood waiting for them, and the reunion was one of quiet dignity, a clasp of hands, a murmur of words in their own language. The cage had been opened. 3 days later, a historic meeting took place by the slow-moving creek. The newly formed town council, represented by Eleanor, Abernathy, and Deputy Rowan, met with Dasodahai, the Chiricahua elder. Taza stood between the 2 groups, a bridge not just of words, but of understanding. The air was not filled with lofty speeches or grand apologies. It was a conversation grounded in the hard realities of the land they all had to share. Dasodahai, speaking through Taza, spoke of the paths their people had always used to travel between the high country and the river, paths that the railroad surveyors had marked with stakes. He spoke of the bitter root that grew on the north-facing slopes, a vital part of their winter stores, a place where the settlers' cattle had begun to graze. Abernathy, in turn, spoke of the need for water for their herds, of the fear of wolves coming down from the mountains in a hard winter. Slowly, carefully, they began to draw a new map, not on paper, but in words, a covenant. They agreed on a schedule for grazing, on which lands were to be left fallow for the wild herbs to grow. They marked the ancestral paths as inviolate, to be kept clear of fences and wagons. They established shared hunting rights in the foothills, with a promise to manage the deer population together, so that neither side would exhaust it. It was not a perfect peace, and the deep wounds of the past were not magically healed. But it was a start. It was a justice built by the community itself, a law written in the language of mutual respect and the shared need for survival. That evening, Eleanor and Taza sat on the porch of the post office, watching the last of the light paint the mesas in strokes of orange and deep purple. The town was quiet, a peaceful, weary kind of quiet. A great weight had been lifted from both of them, but it was replaced not by joy, but by a profound sense of exhaustion and a sober understanding of the world. "It is not over," Taza said, his voice a low murmur. "There will be other men like Vane. The railroad will still come." "I know," Eleanor replied, her gaze on the distant horizon. "But we will be ready for them. We are not alone anymore." She felt a deep sense of peace, but it was a peace edged with the knowledge of how fragile it was, how fiercely it had to be protected. She had her home back, her purpose, but the fight had changed her. The walls she had built around her heart had been broken open, not just by fear, but by trust and by a love she had never expected to feel again. Taza sat beside her, his presence a solid, reassuring anchor in the twilight. He was a man who had walked out of the shadows and spoken the truth, a truth that had cost him dearly but had also set him, and his people, on a new path. They knew the future would hold more trials. Prejudice was a weed with deep roots, and greed was a thirst that was never quenched. But looking at the quiet street, at the lights coming on in the windows of her neighbors' homes, and feeling the steady, calming presence of the man beside her, Eleanor felt a sense of hope that was stronger than any legal document. They had found their place. They would face what was coming.
not as a widow and a wanderer, not as a white woman and an Apache, but as two people who had chosen to stand together, to preserve what was good in this hard, beautiful land. They would stay together. The first rains came in the night, not with the violent fury of the storm in the canyon, but with a soft, steady persistence. It was a sound Eleanor had almost forgotten, a gentle drumming on the adobe roof that was the opposite of the wind's harsh scour. It was a sound of healing. She lay awake for a long time, listening, with Taza's steady breathing a quiet rhythm beside her. The air coming through the open window was cool and heavy with a scent she had longed for all through the dry season, the smell of dust turning to earth, the deep, clean perfume of life returning. In the morning, the world was transformed. The relentless red had been washed to a soft terracotta. The sky was a pale, clean-swept blue, and the creek, for so long a silent, stony scar on the landscape, was running. It was not a flood, but a gentle, purposeful current of brown water, gurgling over the rocks, breathing life back into the thirsty roots of the cottonwoods and willows along its banks. The whole town seemed to take a collective, relieved breath. The long, dry season of fear and lies was over. The most profound change, however, was not in the landscape, but in the small schoolhouse. When Eleanor rang the morning bell, the usual handful of settler children came, their boots muddy, their faces bright, but with them came 4 others. They were Chiricahua children, brought by their mothers who stood watching shyly from the doorway. They were quiet, their dark eyes wide, taking in the strange world of chalkboards and primers. Eleanor's heart swelled with a feeling so powerful it was almost painful. This was the covenant made real. She welcomed them with a smile, showing them to a bench near the front. There was a moment of awkward, silent appraisal. The settler children stared, uncertain. The Chiricahua children sat stiffly, their hands clasped in their laps. For a moment, the invisible wall of history and prejudice stood between them. Eleanor did not address it directly. She began the day's lesson not with words, but with pictures. She gave each child, settler and Chiricahua alike, a piece of slate and a nub of fresh white chalk. She began to draw on the large board at the front of the room. She drew a horse, then a coyote, then a soaring eagle. She drew the sun and the moon. These were things they all knew, a language that needed no translation. Slowly, hesitantly at first, the children began to draw. A small boy with bright red hair, the son of the blacksmith, tried to draw a horse that looked more like a dog. One of the Chiricahua girls beside him, her black hair in 2 neat braids, watched him for a moment. Then, without a word, she took her own slate and with a few swift, certain strokes, drew a perfect, powerful Mustang, its mane flying in an imaginary wind. The boy stared at it in awe. The girl looked at him, a tiny, shy smile touching her lips, and then she broke her piece of chalk in 2 and offered him half. The wall had its first crack. Taza spent much of the day working with the horses he was training, but he found himself drifting back toward the schoolhouse. He stood under the shade of the blacksmith's awning, watching the open door. He could hear the low murmur of Eleanor's voice, the occasional burst of a child's laughter. He saw the children moving, interacting, sharing a world that their parents had almost destroyed. He felt a fragile, unaccustomed warmth spread through his chest. It was not the fierce, protective fire of the warrior, but the gentle, steady glow of hope. The future, which had for so long seemed like a closing door, now looked like an open path. That evening, as the full moon rose over the newly washed landscape, he led her from the porch of the post office. He did not say where they were going, and she did not ask. She knew. He led her into the Badlands, to the sheltered hollow at the base of the mesa, to the ancient mesquite tree that had been their sanctuary. The moonlight filtered through the leaves, just as it had on that terrible, transformative night. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and the sweet perfume of the mesquite blossoms. Taza had brought a single, finely braided cord of dark leather. It was something he had made himself, its strands woven with a skill that was both beautiful and strong. He took her hands in his. They were no longer trembling. "My life has been a long lesson in what can be lost," he said, his voice a low, steady murmur in the quiet night. "My people, our lands, our safety. I learned to hold the memories of these things inside me, to build a wall around them to keep them safe. But a wall that keeps sorrow in also keeps joy out." He looked into her eyes, and she saw the history of his people there, the long story of pain and endurance. But she also saw something new, something that was just for her. "You walked through the desert," he continued. "You faced the liars and the men with guns. You were not afraid to be broken. You taught me that a heart is not a stone to be guarded. It is a seed. It must be planted to grow." Eleanor felt tears well in her eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow. "I was a prisoner of my own fear," she said, her voice soft. "Samuel's death locked me away. I thought I was safe in my small, quiet life. But it was not safety. It was just a different kind of cage. You showed me what it was to be brave. Not just to face a gun, but to face the world with an open heart." Taza took the leather cord. He gently took her left wrist, then his own right, and with a series of deft, symbolic knots, he tied them together. The cord was not tight, but it was a firm, unbreakable link between them. He looked at the knot, then back at her. "I will keep the memories," he vowed. "I will never forget the past, for it is who I am. And I will keep my heart open," she promised, her voice filled with a peaceful, certain joy. "For that is who I want to be." They stood together under the moonlit branches of the old tree, bound by a simple leather cord and a promise that was stronger than any law or document. It was a promise to face the future together, carrying the weight of their pasts not as burdens, but as shared histories that made their present bond all the more profound. A week later, Deputy Jake Rowan stopped by the post office as Eleanor was sorting the evening mail. Taza was on the porch, mending a bridle, the familiar, rhythmic work of his hands a calming presence. Rowan accepted a cup of coffee and leaned against a porch post. "Things are quiet," he said, a note of satisfaction in his voice. "Too quiet, maybe." He took a sip of coffee. "The stage driver was telling me something interesting today. Said he saw some new surveyors up north, in the foothills of the Chiricahua Mountains. Not railroad men, mining men. Heard talk of a big copper company from back east sniffing around." Eleanor and Taza exchanged a look. It was a look that passed between them without a word, a look of complete and sober understanding. The storm had passed, but there were always new clouds on the horizon. The greed that had driven Silas Vane was not unique to him. It was a feature of the land, as permanent as the mountains themselves. But the fear that would have once gripped Eleanor's heart was gone. The cold rage that might have once consumed Taza was tempered. They had faced the storm and found their strength, not just in themselves, but in each other, and in the small, stubborn community that had learned to stand together. The future was uncertain. There would be new fights, new threats, but as they sat together in the fading light, listening to the gentle murmur of the creek, they knew they would not face them alone. The rains had come, and in the hard, beautiful land of Mesquite Crossing, something new had finally begun to grow. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment below where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And be sure to subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales, like this video. And support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.